I woke up that morning feeling like the world had finally aligned for me. Graduation day, the culmination of years of late nights, endless papers, and sacrifices that nobody had noticed. I dressed carefully in my gown, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders, rehearsing the proud smile I thought my parents would want to see. I imagined their applause, their hugs, their eyes brimming with pride. For once, I wanted to feel like I mattered to them. I stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling my lungs, and my heart thrummed with excitement. Friends were bustling around me, families taking pictures, laughter and chatter weaving through the crowd. And yet, when I scanned the sea of faces, I didn't see them, my parents. Not a hint of them anywhere. Panic prickled at the edges of my chest, mingling with exhaustion from the sleepless nights and anxiety that had been my constant companion. I waited, hoping they were just running late, that somehow they'd appear with smiling faces, waving and proud. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the anticipation twisting into a dull ache of disappointment. Then it happened. I collapsed. My body gave out beneath the weight of stress, fatigue, and the unbearable sting of neglect. People rushed to help, hands gripping my arms, concerned voices piercing the haze of humiliation. But even in that blur, all I could see was the empty space where my parents should have been. The shame was immediate, sharp, and suffocating. I had imagined this day as a pinnacle, a moment of recognition and love, and instead, I felt invisible, abandoned in front of everyone I knew. Tears blurred my vision as I was helped to a bench, and the cruel truth settled like a stone in my chest. They hadn't come. They didn't care enough to show up, not for my triumph, not for me. The whispers around me, the sideways glances, the muffled murmurs of sympathy, they all became a chorus of my failure, though I knew deep down it wasn't mine. The betrayal cut deeper than the exhaustion, sharper than the physical collapse. And yet, even in that moment of raw humiliation, a tiny ember of defiance sparked within me. If they wouldn't show up for me, I realized, I would have to stand for myself. The ache of abandonment mingled with the first flicker of empowerment, a contradictory heat in my chest that whispered I wasn't done yet. This day, my day, had begun in the worst way possible, but somewhere in the collapse, in the gaping hole left by their absence, I felt the stirrings of a story that wasn't over, a chapter that would be mine to write, even if they refused to witness it. Even as I sat there, trying to catch my breath and steady the trembling of my hands, my mind wandered back through years of small, sharp disappointments. It wasn't just today. They had been absent in countless ways, long before graduation. I remembered my 10th birthday, my carefully folded invitations, the cake I had begged them to help me decorate. Instead, they fussed over my cousin, whose party they deemed more important, leaving me with a store-bought cake and a shrug. I had smiled for the camera anyway, hiding the sting behind forced laughter, a skill I had honed over years of being overlooked. Then there was the science fair, the regional one where I had poured hours into my project, calculating, designing, crafting every detail. My sibling, always the golden child, was handed a ribbon for participation that somehow felt more like an accolade than my hard-earned medal. My parents had clapped politely, offered a good job, and moved on. Each instance etched a pattern in me, a quiet lesson that their love and attention were conditional, doled out to the child who caused the least inconvenience or brought the most immediate pride. Even family vacations weren't spared from comparison. I remembered that summer we were supposed to go to the beach. My sibling had the room closest to the ocean, the better umbrella, the bigger portion of ice cream, while I got leftovers and the task of carrying towels and chairs. At the time, I tried to rationalize it as fairness. But now I saw the painful favoritism for what it was, a constant reminder of where I stood in their eyes. And still, I loved them. I wanted them to notice, to care, to be proud of me. I wanted their approval as desperately as anyone might crave air or sunlight. That need, that yearning, had followed me into adulthood, warping every expectation, shaping every hope for recognition. Sitting on that bench, the empty space beside me screamed louder than any words could. The years of neglect, of being overlooked, of being the other child, all of it collided in a single overwhelming wave of humiliation and grief. I understood now that my collapse was not just physical. It was the embodiment of every moment I had been sidelined, every hug I had longed for but never received, every opportunity where they chose someone else. And in that awareness, a strange clarity emerged. The pain they caused was theirs to bear, not mine, yet it had fueled me in ways I hadn't acknowledged. It had shaped resilience, the same resilience that would eventually allow me to stand tall even when they refused to stand with me. As I tried to gather myself, I caught fragments of conversation from the crowd around me, voices just loud enough to pierce the haze of my humiliation. "Did you see her collapse? Her parents didn't even bother showing up." Another voice sneered. "Typical. They never support her. Always someone else's favourite." Each word landed like a stone in my chest. I had imagined being celebrated, standing proudly in my cap and gown, but instead I was the centre of whispered judgments and sideways glances. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a public announcement of my insignificance in the eyes of the people who mattered most. The cruel irony of it all was unbearable. I overheard a friend of my cousin laughing, talking about how the family always favoured her, how she was destined for success, while I struggled just to be noticed. The sting of their indifference had always been private, a secret ache I carried alone, but now it was broadcast, amplified by the murmurs and knowing smirks. The FOMO I had felt all those years, seeing my sibling praised, watched, celebrated, became tangible in that moment. Every glance reminded me that I had been sidelined, my victories diminished, my presence discounted. The social hierarchy in my family was on full display, and I was painfully aware that I was at the bottom, invisible in comparison. My cheeks burned, not only from embarrassment but from a deep, simmering anger that had been building for years. The whispers, the judgment, the casual cruelty, they weren't just about today. They were echoes of a lifetime, reinforcing a narrative I had been fed my entire existence, that I was less, undeserving, somehow inferior. And yet, amidst the shame, there was a flicker of something else, an acute awareness that if they could treat me like this publicly, then their power over me was not absolute. This moment, though humiliating, was also a catalyst. I could hear the whispers, feel the judgment, but I could also see the gap between their perception and my potential. It hurt, it stung, it humiliated me, but it also planted the first seed of resolve. After I was helped to a bench on the side of the auditorium, still shaking from the collapse, my first instinct was to reach for my phone. Even after everything, years of imbalance, years of pretending the favoritism didn't slice me open, I still hoped that maybe, just maybe, my parents would care enough to pick up. My hands trembled as I pressed their numbers, the familiar contact names glowing on my screen like a lifeline I'd been gripping far too tightly. The first call rang out, then the second. By the third, I already knew the pattern. Straight to voicemail. No call back, no message, no concern. It was absurd how quickly hope could shrivel into something bitter and heavy. I stared at my phone like it was betraying me too, the silence on the other end louder than the noise of the crowd. I told myself they might be busy. Maybe they didn't hear it. Maybe they were on their way. But deep down, buried under years of excuses I'd rehearsed for them, I felt the truth tightening its grip. They simply didn't care enough to answer. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Not from the collapse, but from the realization that I was once again alone in a moment where any parent would have rushed over without thinking. I pressed my palm against my chest as if that could steady the cracking inside. My thoughts spiraled. If they loved me, Wouldn't they be here? Wouldn't they answer? Wouldn't they at least check? That familiar ache settled in, an ache I had spent most of my life pretending wasn't there. Abandonment. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet and persistent. The kind that seeps into your self-worth like a slow poison. My internal monologue turned cruel, echoing every insecurity I thought I'd outgrown. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe the reason they never showed up was me. It was humiliating to realize how desperate I was for people who had never been desperate for me. My graduation day was supposed to be proof that I mattered, that I achieved something worth celebrating. Instead, it felt like evidence of my loneliness. I watched other graduates hug their parents, pose for photos, receive flowers and long, tight embraces. Those moments stabbed me in places I didn't even know were vulnerable anymore. I wondered if loyalty to family meant anything when it wasn't returned. Was I supposed to keep loving them out of obligation? Was I supposed to keep pretending everything was fine just because I was used to the pain? The more I sat with the silence, the more I questioned the rules I had lived by. Why had I spent years believing that suffering quietly was a form of strength? Why had I equated endurance with love? The disappointment wasn't new, but something about today made it impossible to swallow. Maybe it was the public nature of it. Maybe it was the accumulation of years. Maybe it was simply that I had grown tired. Tired of chasing, tired of hoping, tired of shrinking myself to earn scraps of affection. I felt tears build, but they weren't just from sadness. They were from the dawning realization that their absence was shaping me into someone I didn't want to be. Someone small, someone doubting, someone afraid to believe they deserved better. And yet, amid the chaos of my emotions, there was a quiet shift inside me. A thought I had never allowed myself to fully feel rose to the surface. Maybe family isn't defined by blood. Maybe loyalty shouldn't be one-sided. Maybe love, real love, shouldn't have to be begged for. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, I questioned whether staying loyal to people who abandoned me was worth the cost of abandoning myself. Just when the weight of abandonment felt unbearable, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna, my best friend since middle school. She had seen the pictures from graduation online and sensed, without me having to explain, the storm of emotions I was drowning in. Her words weren't just comforting, they were grounding. You are incredible, and anyone who doesn't see that is blind. Don't let them define your worth. I stared at the screen, letting the words sink into the hollow spaces left by my parents' absence. For the first time that day, I felt the tiniest flicker of something I hadn't let myself feel in years, validation that wasn't conditional. Jenna insisted I come over, and as I walked into her apartment, I let the tears flow without shame. She listened without judgment, offering gentle reassurances and reminding me of everything I had accomplished. Academic success, resilience, the quiet battles I'd fought alone. She didn't just comfort me, she mirrored back the strength I had always carried but never acknowledged. Her presence lit a spark of internal resistance I hadn't realized I possessed. If I could survive this humiliation, if I could confront these feelings without collapsing again, maybe I didn't need their approval to define myself. We talked for hours, dissecting the years of favoritism and neglect. Jenna pointed out patterns I had accepted as normal, but hearing them voiced aloud reframed everything. They chose who they wanted to celebrate, but that doesn't diminish your accomplishments. It only shows their limits, not yours. I felt the embers of empowerment stir within me, subtle but undeniable. For the first time, I imagined a version of myself where I didn't bend to their whims, where I could set boundaries without guilt, where their opinion didn't dictate my value. As evening settled, I felt steadier, more centered. The fear and shame hadn't vanished, but the narrative had shifted. I realized that for too long, I had been carrying the burden of their indifference as if it defined me. Now I glimpsed the possibility of reclaiming control, even in small ways. Then my phone buzzed again. A new message, this time from an unknown number that immediately made my stomach twist. It was from my parents. Simple, cryptic, and unnervingly casual. "Can we meet? We need to talk." My chest tightened. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to walk away and stay protected in the bubble of self-worth Jenna had helped me find. But curiosity gnawed at me, mixed with the unresolved tension of everything they had ignored for so long. Whatever they wanted to say, it was clear they were trying to pull me back into their orbit, to test if I was still the pliable child I had always been. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering, heart pounding. I had tasted empowerment, and the thought of slipping back into their control sent a shiver down my spine. But the unknown hung in front of me like a door, and I knew that crossing its threshold could change everything. Again. A few days later, I finally agreed to meet them at a quiet cafe they claimed was neutral ground. My heart thudded in my chest the entire ride, a mix of apprehension and reluctant curiosity. When I walked in, they were already seated, faces carefully composed, hands folded as if rehearsing the sincerity I was supposed to feel. Their smiles were practiced, too perfect, too polished, and it made something inside me tighten with suspicion. They launched into their story almost immediately. A financial mess, they said. A sudden legal issue that threatened the stability of the family estate. They needed my help, my connections, my knowledge, my resources. Every word was delivered with just enough guilt and urgency to tug at the strings I had worked so hard to free myself from. I listened, the old reflex kicking in, the part of me that had always been the dutiful child aching to step forward, to fix things that weren't even my responsibility. But the voice in my head, the one I had barely acknowledged until Jenna's support, pushed back. "You've spent years being their second choice, always the fallback. Why should you be the one to bail them out now?" Every example they offered, every desperate glance and half-tear, was met with memories I had long buried. Birthdays ignored, graduations unattended, countless sacrifices unnoticed. I could almost hear the echoes of my younger self, desperate for approval, saying yes, saying anything to be loved. But the adult in me, the one who had begun to see their manipulation clearly, bristled. I felt the tension coil inside like a spring, my pulse quickening as I weighed the moral dilemma. Helping them now could restore a semblance of family unity, or so they implied, but it would also signal that I was still the child who could be summoned at will, still bound by obligations they had never honoured. Saying no felt revolutionary, terrifying, and liberating all at once. I realised this was the first real test of the boundaries I had started to set, the first moment where I could assert that my loyalty was not unconditional, that my empathy had limits. The conversation dragged on, each of their justifications and excuses more elaborate than the last. I kept my composure, nodding politely while internally dissecting every word, every glance, every sigh. I was no longer blindly reactive. I was evaluating, strategizing, and feeling the early stirrings of empowerment deepen. By the time the meeting ended, I walked away with a knot in my stomach, both from the pressure of their expectations and from the exhilarating realization that I had a choice. For the first time in decades, I could decide whether I would let them dictate my actions or whether I would reclaim the narrative. And as I slipped the cafe door behind me, I felt a mixture of fear and thrill, knowing that the next step, the answer I gave, would change everything. As I walked away from the cafe, my mind kept circling back to all the times I had given without being seen. I remembered covering my siblings' tuition when their scholarship fell short, quietly moving money around to make sure they could attend the program their parents had declared non-essential. I remembered nights I stayed up helping with homework, projects, and essays that weren't mine, smiling through exhaustion while my own dreams simmered on the back burner. I had been the emotional buffer too, absorbing their anger, soothing tempers, taking blame for things I hadn't done, all in the hope of keeping the fragile family equilibrium intact. Each memory stung sharper now than it had at the time, because I could see clearly how unappreciated it had been. I had sacrificed not for recognition, but out of love and duty, and yet the gratitude had never come. Even today, when I had collapsed at graduation and needed them most, they hadn't even appeared. The pattern was undeniable. My efforts were invisible unless they served someone else's interests or boosted their image. Anger bubbled beneath my chest, hot and insistent. It wasn't just hurt anymore, it was outrage. Years of bending, giving, and excusing had left me stronger than I realized, but it also made the sting of neglect sharper. I had been complicit in my own invisibility for far too long. The realization was both infuriating and clarifying. If I had carried this family for so long without acknowledgement, then I also held the power to finally step back, to reclaim what had been mine all along. I clenched my fists as I remembered every overlooked birthday, every unpaid favor, every silent compromise. The moral weight of their request for help now felt absurd. They were asking me to extend myself yet again, to give in spite of decades of neglect, as if nothing mattered but their convenience, and that, more than any humiliation or absence, was what fueled the fire within me. The outrage was no longer quiet. It demanded attention, and I knew that this time I couldn't ignore it. I had given enough, I had suffered enough, and the choice before me, the opportunity to finally say no, was mine to seize. I found myself sitting in a quiet corner of a cafe with two of my closest friends, trying to untangle the knot of emotions that had been tightening around me since graduation. "You can't just hand over everything to them again," Jenna said firmly, stirring her coffee like it grounded her as much as her words grounded me. "They've taken from you for years. Why would this be any different?" Across from her, Mark, ever the realist, shrugged. "I get that, but families are complicated. Sometimes you just have to step in, even if it feels unfair." His voice carried an edge of doubt I hadn't anticipated, and I realized how easy it would be to convince myself to give in, just to avoid confrontation or guilt. I bit my lip, thinking aloud. But what if I said no? What if I just let them deal with the mess themselves? Jenna's eyes narrowed. Then maybe for the first time they'd actually see you as a person, not someone they can exploit. Don't you want that? Mark leaned back, contemplative. But you have to be careful. Saying no is one thing, but completely walking away has consequences too. Are you ready for them to be angry, embarrassed, even vindictive? I hesitated, my mind racing. Part of me fantasized about power. The kind I had never had with them, enough control to finally dictate the terms. I imagined standing firm, watching them squirm, maybe even realize how much they had relied on me all these years. The thought made my pulse quicken. And yet, the fear lingered. Would they have cared if I were rich? Would they have shown up for graduation if I had bought my way into their attention? The question burned like acid, highlighting every inequality, every favoritism, every invisible slight I'd endured. The conversation shifted seamlessly between empathy, practicality, and outrage, and with each argument, I felt my resolve harden. My friends weren't just offering advice, they were reflecting back the strength I had always possessed but never fully trusted. The potential for power reversal began to crystallize in my mind, the ability to take control of this story, of their expectations, of my own narrative. For the first time, I understood that saying no could be more than defiance. It could be a reclamation of authority I had been denied for years. A week after the cafe conversation, I felt a quiet satisfaction as I crossed a small but meaningful milestone. I had been juggling multiple freelance projects and side commitments for months, struggling to pay off lingering debts and build a sense of independence. That morning, I finalized the last payment on a loan that had weighed me down for years. Holding the confirmation in my hands, I felt a rush of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else, especially not my parents. For once, I was claiming control over my own life, and it was exhilarating. I thought about them briefly, imagining their obliviousness. They had no idea I had done this, no clue that I was quietly freeing myself from the very burdens they had imposed, intentionally or not. That contrast stung in the best possible way. I was growing stronger, step by step, while they remained trapped in their narrow view of me as the compliant, overlooked child. I allowed myself a small, triumphant smile, savouring the realisation that their ignorance no longer diminished me. The victory, though modest in the world's eyes, felt monumental in my own. It wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming autonomy, proving to myself that I could survive and thrive without waiting for approval from people who had consistently undervalued me. I felt the ember of empowerment ignite further, an unmistakable shift in how I saw myself and my potential. Even as I celebrated quietly, I recognized the subtle power I now wielded. They could ask, plead, even manipulate all they wanted, but the dynamics were no longer the same. The scales had begun to tip, and for the first time, I felt a tangible sense of control over a story I had long thought was written by others. The day of the meeting arrived, and I felt a storm of anticipation swirling in my chest. When I walked into the restaurant, they were already seated, the same carefully rehearsed expressions I had seen before. Their eyes widened slightly when they saw me, a mix of relief and calculation flickering across their faces. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the awareness that the balance of power had shifted, even if they didn't realize it yet. "We really need your help," my mother began, her voice low, almost pleading. "This situation, it's urgent. Without you, we might lose everything," my father chimed in, softer, desperate, but carrying that familiar undertone of expectation. "We're in over our heads. You're the only one who can fix this." I sat silently for a moment, letting their words hang in the air. The cafe around us buzzed with life, but in that bubble, time seemed to stretch. My chest tightened as years of neglect, favoritism, and public humiliation surged back in sharp waves. Their sudden desperation, the audacity of expecting me to drop everything for them now, ignited a slow-burning fury inside me. "You've always relied on me," I said carefully, my voice steady but carrying the weight of every past betrayal. "And yet, the moments when I needed you most, you weren't there. Graduation, birthdays, everything I sacrificed, you never noticed." My words seemed to stun them. I could see their faces flicker between guilt and disbelief, as if they expected tears or excuses, not the firm assertion of my perspective. They interjected quickly, voices overlapping. "We didn't realize. It's not what it looks like. We just need—" I held up my hand, silencing them. "No. I hear what you're saying now, but do you think your sudden crisis erases years of absence? Do you think begging me for help makes up for every time you failed me?" Their eyes widened, and for the first time, I noticed the shift. The power had subtly but undeniably changed. I was no longer the desperate child who would bend to their needs. I was calm, assertive, and fully aware of my own value. The weight of years of neglect sat between us, palpable, and yet I felt lighter than I had in decades. They tried again, softer now, carefully choosing words, but the manipulation felt thin, transparent. I realized that their desperation, which might once have forced compliance, now only highlighted their recklessness and entitlement. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. The stage was set, the tension peaked. Their pleas, their calculated guilt, their veiled threats, all of it hung suspended, and I held the final move. I took a deep breath, feeling the surge of years, decades even, of frustration and abandonment boil into clarity. "No," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I won't be the one to fix this for you. I've carried your burdens for years, sacrificed my own time, my energy, my opportunities, and I am done." My parents froze, mouths opening and closing like fish, unable to catch a response that would undo the damage. My mother's eyes glistened with something between guilt and disbelief. But we really need you. We don't have anyone else. I shook my head slowly, letting the weight of my words settle in the space between us. That's not my responsibility anymore. You neglected me when it mattered. You ignored every achievement, every struggle, every plea for support, and now, when it finally counts for you, I am not your safety net. My father's usual air of authority faltered. He leaned forward, his voice tight. You're being unreasonable. Unreasonable, I interrupted gently but firmly. No, I'm being realistic. I'm finally being honest with myself and with you. You have had every opportunity to recognize my worth, but instead you chose favoritism, neglect, and absence. That stops here. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, a potent mix of fear, anger, and exhilaration. The cafe seemed to shrink around us, every glance from the staff and patrons magnifying the intensity. I had imagined this confrontation 1,000 times, but the reality exceeded even my boldest expectations. The power, the control, the shift in dynamic. It was intoxicating. My parents sat back, stunned, their carefully maintained composure fractured. I could see the shock, the silent calculations, the disbelief that I had the audacity to finally set boundaries. And in that silence, in that small yet monumental declaration, I felt an immense weight lift from my chest. This was not vengeance in the traditional sense, this was empowerment. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming myself, my energy, my life. I leaned back, letting them absorb the finality of my decision, knowing that nothing I said could be twisted into the old narrative. I was no longer their tool, their safety net, or the overlooked child they thought they could summon at will. I had spoken, and in that word, simple, definitive, unyielding, I had won. The shock in their eyes only confirmed what I already knew. The scales had shifted, and I finally held my ground. Walking away from that meeting, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and calm I hadn't experienced before. The tension that had gripped me for years, the constant need to anticipate their moods, to manage their expectations, to sacrifice endlessly for their convenience, was finally lifting. For the first time, I felt free to breathe, to exist without their invisible leash tugging at my every decision. The relief was intoxicating, not just because I had said no, but because I had done it without guilt, without hesitation, without the lingering fear of being unworthy. In the days that followed, friends and colleagues noticed the change in me. Jenna messaged almost daily, cheering me on for asserting boundaries, celebrating the quiet strength radiating from my newfound confidence. At work, a supervisor remarked on my composed leadership during a challenging project, noting how I handled situations with decisiveness and grace. Even casual acquaintances seemed to regard me differently, as if the aura of self-respect and empowerment I carried couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, subtle consequences rippled through my family. My parents' financial request faltered without my support, exposing their lack of preparation. Friends within our social circle began whispering about their overreach, about how they had expected me to bail them out yet again. They experienced mild embarrassment and realized, perhaps too late, that their habitual neglect had created a crack in the image of control they always tried to project. I didn't relish their discomfort, but there was undeniable satisfaction in knowing that the imbalance had shifted. As I reflected, I understood that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement about my worth, my boundaries, and my right to prioritize myself. I had spent decades being the overlooked, undervalued child, but those years of endurance had also forged resilience, clarity, and strength. Saying no wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an assertion of justice, the kind that doesn't require revenge to feel complete. I walked with a new sense of presence, aware that I no longer needed approval to define my life. that the respect I earned for myself outweighed any conditional recognition they might offer. Months later, I found myself standing in front of a packed conference room, receiving an award for a project I had poured countless hours into. The applause was genuine, heartfelt, and for the first time in my life, it wasn't filtered through the lens of my family's indifference. Colleagues congratulated me, sharing admiration for my skill, dedication, and vision. Every handshake, every smile, every nod of acknowledgement reinforced a truth I had long suspected but never fully embraced. My worth was independent of their recognition. I thought about my parents in that moment, likely unaware that I had achieved this milestone, that I had built a life of respect and stability without their guidance or approval. The irony was deliciously subtle. They had assumed I would always bend, always give, always prioritize them over myself. Yet here I was, celebrated publicly, thriving in ways they had underestimated, while they remained tangled in the consequences of their own neglect. It wasn't about boasting or rubbing it in their faces. It was about quiet vindication. The satisfaction came from knowing that my achievements were authentic, hard-earned, and undeniable. Every award, every accolade, every recognition I received was a small, persistent echo of the boundaries I had set and the empowerment I had claimed. The social and professional validation that had once seemed so distant now confirmed what I had long hoped. I was more than enough, and I no longer needed their approval to prove it. Sitting alone one evening, I let myself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in years. The chaos of graduation, the confrontations, the ultimatums, all of it had passed, leaving me with a profound sense of clarity. I realized that my worth had never been contingent on their attention, their praise, or their presence. Every achievement, every boundary I had set, every step toward independence was proof that I could define my life on my own terms. The lessons I carried were clear. Love and loyalty are not obligations to those who consistently fail to honor them. Sacrifice is meaningful only when it is chosen freely, not demanded or exploited. I had learned to trust my instincts, to listen to the quiet voice of self-respect, and to recognize the difference between compassion and enabling. Yet I also acknowledged that not all wounds had fully healed. The sting of neglect, the echo of favoritism, and the absence of parental support remained in corners of my heart, reminders of the past I could not erase. Even with those lingering pains, I felt empowered, resilient, and capable. I had reclaimed the narrative of my life, and in doing so I had discovered a quiet, enduring strength. Independence was no longer a distant dream, it was my reality. I understood now that true empowerment didn't require erasing the past, but learning from it, embracing it, and moving forward with intention. The future was mine to shape, and finally, I felt ready to live it unapologetically, anchored in self-worth and guided by the knowledge that I would never again let anyone define my value.